In the grim darkness of the far future, there are few things more dangerous than the collision of radically different forces. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is filled with countless horrors, each unique in their methods of spreading destruction across the stars. But when you take one of the most brutal, simplistic races in the galaxy and give them access to one of the most sophisticated, warp-corrupted weapons of war, you create a scenario that defies easy prediction. Today, we're exploring one of the most fascinating and horrifying what-if scenarios in the Warhammer 40k universe. What happens when Orks capture a Sorcerer Dreadnought? This is not a simple question of one army looting another's equipment. This is a fundamental clash between two entirely different realities. On one side, you have the Orks, a race whose technology functions through sheer collective belief and whose psychic gestalt field makes the impossible possible. On the other, you have a Chaos Dreadnought piloted by a corrupted Psyker, a walking tomb that houses both a tortured sorcerer and often a bound demon, all wrapped in armor covered with blasphemous runes and warp-tainted technology. When these two forces meet, when greenskin ingenuity collides with demonic possession, the results are as unpredictable as they are catastrophic. To understand what happens in this scenario, we need to examine multiple layers of complexity. We must understand the Orks and their unique relationship with technology, the nature of Chaos Dreadnoughts, and what makes Sorcerer variants particularly dangerous, and the fundamental incompatibility between the WH40K psychic field and the corruption of Chaos. Only by understanding all these elements can we truly grasp the horror, the comedy, and the absolute devastation that unfolds when an Ork mechboy gets his hands on a demon-possessed war machine, piloted by a 10,000-year-old sorcerer. The stage is set for disaster on a scale that only Warhammer 40k can provide. Let us begin. Understanding Ork technology and looting culture. Before we can understand what happens when Orks capture a Sorcerer Dreadnought, we must first understand the greenskins themselves and their utterly unique relationship with technology. The Orks are one of the most successful species in the galaxy, not because of sophistication or planning, but because of their sheer adaptability and their genetic programming as weapons of war. The Orks were created millions of years ago by the ancient race known as the Old Ones, engineered as biological weapons during the War in Heaven. What makes them so successful is not just their physical prowess or their love of combat, but the fact that every Ork carries within their genetic code the accumulated knowledge of their entire species. This manifests most clearly in the Odd Boys, specialized Orks, who are born with instinctive knowledge of specific tasks. Among these, the mechboys are perhaps the most important to Ork society, as we know it. Mechboys are not engineers in any conventional sense. They do not study, they do not learn through trial and error in the way other races might. Instead, they simply know how to build things. This knowledge is encoded in their DNA, passed down from the brain boys who originally created the Ork species. A mechboy will look at a pile of scrap metal and instinctively understand how it can become a functional weapon or vehicle. They work by feel, by intuition, hammering and welding and bolting pieces together until they have created something that, by all rights, should not work at all. And here is where things get truly strange. Ork technology is famously unreliable when handled by other races. Imperial forces who have captured Ork weapons often find them to be crude, poorly assembled, and in some cases, physically impossible. A shooter might be little more than a metal tube with a trigger mechanism that has no clear path for the ammunition to travel. A truck might have an engine that is missing critical components, or wheels that are not properly attached to any drivetrain. By all logic, by all physical laws, these things should not function, yet they do, and they function because of the way is one of the most important concepts in understanding Ork society and technology. It operates on 3 levels simultaneously. First, it is the massive military campaigns that orcs undertake when enough of them gather under a powerful war boss. Second, it is the collective psychic field that all orcs generate simply by existing in proximity to one another. Third, it is the reality warping effect that this psychic field creates. This third aspect is crucial to understanding orc technology. The WH field does not simply make orcs stronger or more aggressive, though it does do both of those things. It actually alters reality itself to match orc expectations. If enough orcs believe that red vehicles go faster, then red vehicles do go faster. If orcs believe that a particular gun should work, then it works, regardless of whether its construction actually makes any sense. The Adeptus Mechanicus has studied this phenomenon extensively, and their findings are both fascinating and deeply disturbing to their religious sensibilities. During the War of the Beast, tech priests observed that orc weapons would only function when held by orcs themselves. When a human tried to fire a looted orc weapon, it would often fail to operate entirely. The same weapon, in the hands of an orc, would function perfectly. This suggests that the WH field provides something that other races would call a machine spirit, a psychic animating force that makes the physically impossible into functional reality. This brings us to the orc practice of looting. Orcs are natural scavengers and looters. In fact, looting is so ingrained in orc culture that there is an entire specialized caste dedicated to it. The looters are orcs who follow the battlefield like vultures, stripping anything valuable from the wreckage of battle. They prize enemy weapons and vehicles above all else, seeing them as proof of their victories and as useful components for future projects. The process of looting is not subtle. When orcs find a functional enemy vehicle, they do not carefully disassemble it to understand its function. They tear it apart with their bare hands, ripping out anything that looks valuable or interesting. Weapons are pulled from their mounts, armor plates are torn free, and internal components are extracted without any regard for how they might be connected to other systems. To an observer from the Imperium or any other organized faction, this appears to be mindless vandalism, and in many ways, it is. But then the looted components make their way to the mech boys, and something remarkable happens. The mech boy will look at this pile of disconnected, damaged components and immediately begin to see possibilities. That Imperial battle cannon could be mounted on a truck. That targeting system could be welded to a big shooter. That armor plating could be bolted onto a def dread. The mech boy does not need to understand how these components were originally designed to function. They simply know, instinctively, how to make them work in new and horrifying ways. The results of orc looting are vehicles and weapons that are simultaneously terrifying and absurd. A looted Lehman Russ tank might have had all of its original weapons replaced with orc equivalents, its armor reinforced with mismatched plates bolted on at random angles, and its engine improved with modifications that would make any tech priest weep with rage. The inside might be barely large enough for an orc crew to squeeze into. The controls might be simplified to the point of being dangerous, and the entire vehicle might be painted in garish colors that serve no tactical purpose whatsoever. And yet it works. It works because the orcs believe it works. The WH field fills in the gaps, makes the impossible connections, provides the missing components through sheer psychic will. The tank might be slower and less accurate than its Imperial counterpart, but it is also bigger, louder, and more likely to explode in a satisfying manner when it finally does break down. Looted vehicles are particularly prized by the Death Skulls clan, who have elevated the practice to an art form. Death Skulls orcs can often loot a vehicle, repair it with scavenged parts, and then use it in battle during the same campaign from which they stole it. This requires an impressive level of both audacity and mechanical intuition, even by orc standards. The Death Skulls paint everything they own blue because they believe blue is the luckiest color, and their belief makes it so. The scale of orc looting can be truly staggering. There are legends among the Imperium of an Ork looter called Grabber Gutsbag, who supposedly looted Imperial Titans. Titans are walking cathedrals of war, some standing over 100 feet tall and mounting weapons capable of leveling cities. The idea that an Ork could not only capture one of these god machines but make it work is almost too horrifying to contemplate. Yet, in the Warhammer 40k universe, with the power of the WAG behind them, even this becomes possible. But looting is not just about vehicles and weapons. Orks will loot anything they find useful or interesting. Armor, tools, ammunition, even bits of decorative trim if it is shiny enough. Everything gets torn apart, hammered into new shapes, and incorporated into the growing mass of Ork technology. The more successful a WH becomes, the more sophisticated its arsenal becomes, not through innovation, but through endless iteration and modification of captured equipment. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. As Orks win battles, they capture more equipment. More equipment means more raw materials for the mech boys. More modifications mean more unique and powerful weapons. More powerful weapons mean more victories. And all the while, the WAG field grows stronger with each success, with each Ork who hears of the fighting and joins the horde, until you have a force that can threaten entire sectors of space. It is into this culture of crude ingenuity, violent modification, and reality-warping belief that we must imagine a Chaos Sorcerer Dreadnought falling. The Orks do not understand what they have found. They do not comprehend the dangers of chaos corruption or the complex rituals that bind demons into metal shells. They see only a really big, really tough fighting machine that probably has some excellent gubbins inside. And with that simple observation, they set in motion a chain of events that will test the very limits of what the WAG field can accomplish. The nature of chaos, dreadnoughts, and hellbrutes. To understand the catastrophe that unfolds when Orks attempt to loot a sorcerer dreadnought, we must first understand exactly what a chaos dreadnought is, and more importantly, what it is not. These walking tombs of rage and madness represent one of the most tragic fates that can befall a Chaos Space Marine, a punishment that makes death seem like mercy. During the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, the traitor legions possessed dreadnought technology identical to that of their loyalist brothers. When a space marine was mortally wounded but still valuable to their legion, they could be interred within a dreadnought sarcophagus, their broken bodies sealed within a walking war machine that would allow them to continue fighting for millennia. For the loyalist space marines, this is considered a great honor, a chance to serve the Emperor even beyond death. The ancient warriors who pilot these machines are revered as heroes, their wisdom sought out, and their presence on the battlefield seen as a blessing. For Chaos Space Marines, the experience could not be more different. After the Horus Heresy, when the traitor, legions fled into the Eye of Terror and other warp-corrupted regions of space, the knowledge required to properly construct and maintain dreadnoughts began to fade. The rituals of care, the technology of stasis that might have allowed entombed warriors to sleep peacefully between battles, the medical expertise required to keep a brain alive within a sarcophagus for thousands of years, all of this was lost or deliberately discarded. Worse, the very nature of chaos began to warp and corrupt the dreadnoughts themselves. This corruption gave birth to what are now known as hellbrutes, the most common form of chaos dreadnought. A hellbrute is not just a machine with a pilot. It is a fusion of metal and demonic flesh, a thing that defies the normal laws of reality. The warrior inside the sarcophagus does not sleep between battles. Instead, their sarcophagus is disconnected from the hellbrute's body and hung in special chambers, surrounded by warding runes that barely contain the demons that claw at the imprisoned marine from the other side of reality. The marine inside is not at peace. They are awake, aware, and suffering. They have been awake for centuries, perhaps millennia, with nothing but their own thoughts and the whispers of chaos for company. The body that was once theirs has long since fused with the interior of the sarcophagus, flesh melding with metal until the two are inseparable. The pain is constant. The madness is inevitable. When the Hellbrute is activated and reconnected to its mechanical body, the marine inside is given brief moments of release through violence. They fight with a fury born of desperation, knowing that when the battle ends, they will be returned to their isolation and torment. This makes Hellbrutes incredibly dangerous, but also unpredictable. They have been known to attack their own allies in the midst of battle, so consumed by rage and madness that they can no longer distinguish friend from foe. Unlike loyalist dreadnoughts, Hellbrutes are not honored relics to be preserved. They are manufactured in grotesque daemon forges by warpsmiths and the Dark Mechanicum. The sarcophagi used are parasitic in nature, designed to accelerate the fusion of flesh and metal to enhance the suffering of the marine inside. This is not accidental cruelty, it is deliberate design. The more the pilot suffers, the more rage they can channel in battle, the more useful they become as weapons. The physical form of a Hellbrute reflects this corruption. Where loyalist dreadnoughts are noble and carefully maintained, Hellbrutes are twisted mockeries. Their armor plates might appear to be made of demonic flesh rather than metal. Faces might appear in the metal, screaming silently. The weapons might leak ichor or drip with warp-tainted energies. The entire machine exudes an aura of wrongness that can unsettle even hardened warriors. Older Chaos dreadnoughts, those that date back to the Horus heresy itself, sometimes retain more of their original form. These Ferrum Infernus patterns are relics from an age when the traitor legions still possess the technology to create proper dreadnoughts. They are less overtly corrupted than Hellbrutes, but this does not make them less dangerous. The Marines inside have been conscious for 10,000 years. They have witnessed the long decline of their legions, the slow descent into madness and desperation. Some have maintained their sanity through sheer force of will, becoming tactical geniuses whose experience spans millennia. Others have become monsters, their personalities eroded by time until nothing remains but rage and the desire for oblivion. These ancient dreadnoughts are extremely rare and valuable. Each one represents a warrior who fought alongside the Primarchs, who participated in the Siege of Terror, who remembers a time before the Imperium became the stagnant tyranny it is today. They cannot be easily replaced. When one is destroyed, it represents a permanent loss to whichever warband possessed it. And then there are the Sorcerer dreadnoughts, the rarest and most dangerous variant of all. Sorcerer dreadnoughts, psychic power entombed. The creation of a Sorcerer dreadnought represents one of the greatest technical and occult achievements of the traitor legions, particularly the Thousand Suns. For centuries after the Horus heresy, the problem seemed insurmountable. How do you preserve the psychic powers of a mortally wounded sorcerer when you seal them within a dreadnought sarcophagus? The difficulty is multifaceted. A psyker's connection to the warp is deeply tied to their physical brain and body. When you reduce a human being to little more than a brain and a few organs suspended in amniotic fluid, you risk severing or damaging that connection. The intense trauma of the injuries that necessitate dreadnought internment, combined with the psychological horror of being sealed in a metal tomb, could easily drive a psyker insane or burn out their powers entirely. For a regular space marine, this is merely tragic. For a sorcerer of the Thousand Suns or another psychic-focused legion, it represents the loss of their most valuable asset. The solution came from Magnus the Red himself, the Daemon Primarch of the Thousand Suns. Magnus, who had delved deeper into the mysteries of the warp than perhaps any being save the Emperor himself, developed what he called the Osiren device. This psychometric barrier lattice was designed to crown the sarcophagus, protecting the sorcerer's brain while simultaneously enhancing and focusing their psychic abilities. The technology was incredibly difficult to construct and based on principles that even the most learned psi-arcanists of the Imperium could barely comprehend. The Osiren device essentially created a protected psychic resonance chamber. The sorcerer's consciousness remained fully functional and fully connected to the warp, but the barriers prevented the worst effects of corruption and madness that normally accompanied Dreadnought internment. More than that, the device actually amplified the sorcerer's powers, using the Dreadnought's reactor and systems to boost psychic abilities beyond what they had been capable of in their mortal flesh. The result was the Osiren Pattern Contemptor Dreadnought, a war machine that combined all the firepower and durability of a Contemptor chassis with the reality-warping abilities of a powerful sorcerer. These dreadnoughts could wield force weapons, massive blades that channeled psychic energy with devastating effect. They could cast the full range of psychic powers, from bolts of warp lightning to mind-crushing telepathic assaults. They were, in every sense, mobile psychic artillery platforms wrapped in tons of ceramite armor. Magnus, generous in his scholarly enthusiasm, shared the design of the Osiren device with other legions. The Blood Angels, with their own tradition of psychically gifted warriors, made use of it. The Grey Knights, when they were founded, incorporated similar technology into their own sacred dreadnoughts. But it was the Thousand Sons who made the most extensive use of these machines, seeing them as the perfect way to preserve their most powerful sorcerers. After the Thousand Sons turned to chaos and became embroiled in the machinations of Tzeentch, these sorcerer dreadnoughts took on an even more sinister aspect. The psychometric barriers that had once protected against madness now contained and focused corruption. The sorcerers inside were no longer merely powerful psychers. They were conduits for the raw energies of the warp, channels through which demonic entities could exert influence on reality. Their armor became covered in blasphemous runes and sigils, each one a focal point for dark rituals and forbidden sorcery. A Chaos Sorcerer Dreadnought is not simply a pilot in a machine. It is a walking convergence of multiple dangerous elements. The sorcerer inside is often ancient beyond mortal comprehension, having existed since the Horus Heresy or before. They have spent thousands of years studying forbidden lore, making pacts with demons, and delving into mysteries that would shatter the minds of lesser beings. They are no longer entirely human, if they ever were. Their consciousness has been stretched and warped by millennia of exposure to chaos, until they are as much warp entity as mortal. The Dreadnought chassis itself is corrupted. The metal is not simply metal anymore. It has been exposed to the warp for so long that it has taken on properties that defy physics. It might be harder than it should be, lighter than its mass suggests, or respond to the pilot's thoughts in ways that normal machinery never could. The armor is covered in runes that serve multiple purposes. They enhance the sorcerer's powers. They provide protection against enemy psychers. They bind demonic entities to the chassis, and they serve as focuses for ritual magic. And in many cases, there is a daemon bound within the machine itself. Sorcerer dreadnoughts, particularly those of Tzeentch, often have lesser warp entities imprisoned within their systems. These demons might power certain weapons, enhance the machine's speed or strength, or provide additional psychic abilities. They are bound by complex rituals and warding runes, forced into service against their will. This makes the Dreadnought not just a vehicle with a pilot, but a prison containing at least two sentient entities, one mortal and one demonic, existing in a state of permanent conflict and cooperation. The weapons of a sorcerer dreadnought reflect this dual nature. A force blade, already a weapon that channels psychic energy, becomes something else entirely in the hands of a millennia-old sorcerer bound to a demon. It does not simply cut through physical matter, it slices through reality itself. It can sever souls from bodies, open rifts to the warp, or channel bolts of warp lightning that can melt through the heaviest armor. The combi weapons and heavy weapons mounted on the chassis are similarly enhanced, their ammunition often inscribed with curses or soaked in warp-tainted energies. The psychological impact of encountering a sorcerer dreadnought on the battlefield cannot be overstated. Even before it begins to fight, it radiates an aura of wrongness. Reality seems to bend around it. Shadows fall in directions that make no sense. Temperature fluctuates without reason. Those with even minor psychic sensitivity feel physically ill in its presence. And when it speaks, which it rarely does, its voice carries the weight of the warp itself, sometimes speaking in multiple voices simultaneously, as if the demon within is contributing to the conversation. In combat, a Sorcerer Dreadnought is a terrifying sight. It might stride forward through enemy fire, its force blade crackling with eldritch energy, while simultaneously casting psychic bolts at distant targets. It could summon warp phenomena, creating zones of unreality where the laws of physics no longer apply. It might perform ritual magic in the midst of battle, speaking words of power that cause reality to tear and demons to manifest, all while shrugging off weapons fire that would destroy normal vehicles. The Thousand Sons in particular prize their Sorcerer Dreadnoughts, seeing them as honored repositories of knowledge and power. When one of these ancient warriors falls in battle, it is a loss that cannot easily be replaced. The sorcerer inside possessed wisdom accumulated over thousands of years. The Dreadnought chassis itself was a masterwork of forbidden technology. The rituals and bindings that held the whole thing together were unique, crafted specifically for that individual sorcerer's needs and abilities. This is what makes the prospect of Orks capturing one of these machines so particularly horrifying. They have no understanding of what they are dealing with. They do not comprehend the psychometric barriers, the warding runes, the bound demons, or the psychic resonance chambers. They see a big, tough fighting machine with lots of dakka and some spiky bits that look quite flash. And they immediately set about improving it with Ork technology, utterly oblivious to the catastrophe they are about to unleash. The moment of capture, how it happens. For an Ork warband to capture a Chaos Sorcerer Dreadnought, a very specific set of circumstances must align. These war machines are rare, precious to their owners, and extraordinarily difficult to disable without destroying them entirely. Yet in the vast, chaotic galaxy of Warhammer 40,000, impossible events happen with surprising regularity, and Ork ingenuity combined with sheer bloody-minded persistence can overcome obstacles that would stop more sophisticated races in their tracks. The most likely scenario for such a capture begins with a three-way battle. Orks thrive in chaos, and nowhere is there more chaos than when multiple factions collide in the same war zone. Imagine a chaos warband assaulting an imperial world, their forces including a precious Sorcerer Dreadnought, an ancient relic of the Thousand Sons piloted by a sorcerer who has walked the galaxy for 10,000 years. The Imperials fight desperately, throwing everything they have at the traitors. And then the Orks arrive. Orks are drawn to war like moths to flame. The psychic resonance of large-scale combat calls to them across the void. The wag field pulling them toward battles that promise the kind of excitement they crave. When they detect a major engagement, they do not carefully assess the tactical situation or determine which side they should support. They simply attack whoever looks like they will provide the best fight. In a three-way battle, this usually means attacking everyone. The Sorcerer Dreadnought, ancient and powerful, carves through Imperial lines like a scythe through wheat. Its force blade splits tanks in half. Its psychic powers tear through ranks of guardsmen, making their heads explode or driving them insane with visions of horrors beyond comprehension. Its heavy weapons reduce bunkers to rubble. For thousands of years, this warrior has fought in battles across the galaxy, and its experience shows in every movement, every shot, every swing of its massive blade. But even the most powerful warrior can be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and Orks have numbers in abundance. They crash into the chaos lines in a green tide of roaring bodies, crude guns blazing, choppers raised high. They do not fear the Dreadnought. They do not understand the warp-tainted horror of what they are facing. They see only a really big enemy that is crumping a lot of other gits, which means it must be good at fighting, which means it will be fun to fight. Dozens of orcs throw themselves at the Sorcerer Dreadnought. The ancient warrior cuts them down with contemptuous ease, each swing of its force blade sending half a dozen greenskins flying in pieces. But there are always more. Orcs are fearless to the point of insanity, and the bigger and scarier the enemy, the more eager they are to test themselves against it. They attack from all sides, firing wildly, throwing stick bombs, and simply trying to climb onto the dreadnought to hit it with hammers. The sorcerer inside might be ancient and experienced, but even they cannot account for orc unpredictability. Orcs do not fight by conventional tactics. They do not form proper battle lines or employ sensible strategies. They simply mob the enemy with overwhelming force, trusting that sheer numbers and natural orc toughness will see them through. In this case, their instinct serves them well. The Sorcerer Dreadnought, engaged with multiple threats, might not notice the orc big mech moving into position with a shock attack gun, one of the most unreliable yet devastating weapons in the orc arsenal. Or perhaps a mob of tank busters has positioned themselves with their rockets, waiting for the perfect moment. Or maybe a particularly cunning orc war boss has realized that if they can damage the dreadnought's legs, it will topple and be easier to loot. The critical hit, when it comes, is almost certainly accidental. Orc weapons are not known for precision, but when you are firing thousands of rounds at a target, statistical probability eventually works in your favor. A rocket might strike the dreadnought's leg joint at exactly the wrong angle, severing critical hydraulics. A shock attack gun might malfunction in just the right way, teleporting a handful of angry snotlings directly into the dreadnought's engine compartment, where they wreak havoc on delicate systems. A lucky shot from a big shooter might penetrate a viewing slit and damage optical sensors. The Sorcerer Dreadnought stumbles. It tries to right itself, ancient gyroscopes compensating for the damage, but the orcs are already swarming over it. They pull at cables, hammer at armor plates, and generally tear at anything that looks like it might be important. The sorcerer inside unleashes psychic fury, casting spells that would level buildings and incinerate entire squads of normal enemies. Flames erupt from the ground. Lightning arcs between orcs. Some of the greenskins simply explode into clouds of spores as their brains are turned to mush by telepathic assault. But orcs are partially resistant to psychic attack through the sheer density of their WH40K field. A psychic assault that would instantly kill a human might only daze an orc, and a dazed orc is still an orc, still swinging, still fighting. The more orcs that gather around the dreadnought, the stronger their collective field becomes, providing a kind of inadvertent shielding against the worst of the sorcerer's powers. Eventually, through sheer persistence and an overwhelming expenditure of orc bodies, critical damage is achieved. Perhaps the dreadnought's power core is breached. Perhaps its targeting systems are destroyed. Perhaps the sorcerer inside, exhausted from millennia of warfare and now facing an enemy that seems immune to reason and fear, makes a mistake. The mighty war machine crashes to the ground, its systems failing, smoke pouring from ruptured seals. The orcs immediately descend on it like scavengers on a corpse. They do not kill the sorcerer inside, mostly because they do not realize there is a sorcerer inside. They see a beaten enemy vehicle that has stopped moving. In orc logic, this means it is time for looting. They tear off weapon mounts, pry open access panels, and begin the process of disassembly that precedes any serious looting operation. The sarcophagus containing the sorcerer, embedded deep within the dreadnought's chassis and protected by multiple layers of armor and warding runes, survives the initial looting. The orcs do not recognize it for what it is. They see a weird metal box covered in spiky symbols, and they decide that it probably contains something important or valuable. Rather than trying to open it on the battlefield, which would require actual work, they simply tear the entire compartment free and drag it back to their camp. Inside the sarcophagus, the sorcerer is trapped. Their consciousness remains intact, their psychic powers still potent, but they are disconnected from the Dreadnought systems and unable to interact with the physical world. They are aware of being moved, of Ork voices shouting in their crude language, of the jolting journey back to the Ork settlement. They try to reach out psychically, to either summon aid from their warband or to strike at their captors, but the warding runes that protect their mind also limit their ability to project their power outward without the Dreadnought systems to amplify it. And so, a 10,000-year-old sorcerer of chaos, a warrior who has stood beside demon primarchs and witnessed the fall of entire civilizations, finds themselves being dragged through an Ork camp by greenskins who are arguing about whether the shiny box would look better mounted on a truck or sold to a big mech for a bag of teeth. It is a humiliation beyond measure, and it is only the beginning of their nightmare. Initial looting. The mech boys' first examination. When the Orks drag their prize back to their settlement, it makes its way through the standard chain of Ork property acquisition until it finally reaches the workshop of a mech boy. This journey itself might take days or even weeks, during which the sarcophagus containing the ancient sorcerer is kicked, dropped, used as a seat, and generally treated with all the care one might give to a particularly heavy piece of scrap metal. The workshop of an Ork mech boy is a place of controlled chaos. To an outside observer, it appears to be nothing more than a massive junkyard, with piles of scavenged components, broken vehicles, and half-finished projects scattered everywhere. The air is thick with smoke from forges and the stink of promethium. Gretchens scurry about, some carrying tools, others desperately trying to avoid being stepped on by their larger cousins. The sound is constant, hammering, welding, the roar of engines being tested, and the occasional explosion when an experiment goes wrong. The big mech, who receives the Dreadnought sarcophagus, is, by Ork standards, something of a genius. They have an instinctive understanding of mechanical systems that borders on supernatural. This understanding comes not from study or learning, but from genetic memory encoded by the brain boys millions of years ago. The mech looks at machines and simply knows how they work, or at least how they can be made to work in an Orky fashion. When the sarcophagus is brought before them, the mech's first reaction is excitement. This is clearly high-quality loot, the kind of thing that does not come along every day. The metal is strange, harder than normal ceramite, and it is covered in symbols that even the mech cannot decipher. More importantly, it is clearly from a very big, very tough fighting machine, which means it probably contains very good components. The mech begins their examination by circling the sarcophagus, studying it from all angles. They tap it with a wrench, listening to the sound it makes. They poke at the runes with a metal rod, trying to determine if they are decorative or functional. They identify various connection ports and cable housings where the sarcophagus would have interfaced with the rest of the Dreadnought, and they begin to form a rough understanding of its purpose. "This here is where the pilot sits," the mech might explain to gathered Orks who have come to watch. "And all these cables, they connect the pilot to the big walkie-killy thing. And these weird spiky symbols, they're probably just for show, make it look scary-like." This assessment is, of course, catastrophically wrong. The runes are not decorative. They are warding symbols, carefully inscribed, ritual protections that contain the psychic power of the sorcerer inside and keep bound demons from escaping. But the mech has no context for understanding such things. In their experience, symbols are usually just painted on to make things look flashier. They have no concept of warp corruption, no understanding of psychic resonance, and no idea that the box they are examining contains a conscious, malevolent intelligence that is currently contemplating ways to destroy them all. Inside the sarcophagus, the sorcerer is fully aware of what is happening. They can hear the Orks, though understanding their language is difficult without access to psychic powers for translation. They can feel the vibrations as the mechs hammer and pry at their prison. They are enraged at the indignity of their situation, but they are also calculating, They have survived for 10,000 years by being clever as well as powerful. They begin to plan. The first thing the sorcerer tries is reaching out, psychically, to any nearby chaos forces. Surely their warband is searching for them. Surely rescue is coming. But their efforts are stymied by two factors. First, the warding runes that protect their mind also limit their ability to broadcast psychic signals. Second, and more critically, the WH field generated by the Ork settlement interferes with warp communications in ways the sorcerer has never encountered before. The WH field is not like normal psychic interference. It does not block or absorb psychic energy in the way that a psychic null or a Geller field might. Instead, it warps and redirects it in unpredictable ways. When the sorcerer tries to send out a distress call, they find their psychic message bouncing around inside the WH field like a ball in a closed room, unable to escape but also unable to dissipate. It is frustrating and deeply unsettling. This is not an experience they have ever had before. Meanwhile, the mech has moved on to the practical problem of opening the sarcophagus. There are sealed access panels and what appear to be locking mechanisms, all covered in more of those confusing symbols. The mech could try to carefully unlock these systems, following the proper procedures. But that would require patience and attention to detail, two qualities that Orks are not known for possessing. Instead, the mech takes a more direct approach. They grab the biggest power tool in their workshop, a device that might charitably be called a plasma cutter, and begin trying to cut through the sarcophagus's outer shell. The tool roars to life, sending a jet of superheated plasma against the ancient metal. The metal, forged in the demon forges of the Eye of Terror, and harder than adamantium, resists the cutting beam. But the mech is persistent, and they begin to make progress, slowly burning through layers of armor. As the mech cuts, they inadvertently begin damaging the warding runes. Each rune served multiple purposes: protection for the Shetsis, sorcerer's mind; containment for psychic energy; binding for any demons associated with the machine. As the runes are cut through or burned away, these protections begin to fail. It is not a catastrophic failure, not yet, but cracks are forming in the system. The sorcerer feels the wards weakening and sees an opportunity. If they can time this correctly, if they can wait for the right moment, they might be able to break free and wreak havoc on these green-skin primitives. They begin gathering their psychic power, preparing to unleash it the moment the sarcophagus is opened. But the mech, following Ork logic, does not actually open the sarcophagus in any conventional sense. Instead, having cut through what they believe is enough of the outer shell, they simply grab the whole thing and start hitting it with a hammer. Specifically, they start hitting it with a big hammer, a weapon roughly the size of a small tree that would crush a normal human flat. The impacts are tremendous, shaking the sarcophagus and rattling the sorcerer inside. Each impact sends shockwaves through the carefully balanced systems that keep the sorcerer alive. Amniotic fluids slosh in their tank. Life support systems strain against the violence being done to their housing. The sorcerer, who has endured millennia of suffering, who has survived battles that would break lesser beings, finds themselves being literally beaten like a stubborn piece of machinery that will not cooperate. And here is where things get truly bizarre. The WH field begins to interact with the sorcerer's own psychic emanations in unexpected ways. The sorcerer is radiating frustration, anger, and malevolent intent, all of which are psychic energies. The WH field, which responds to Ork expectations and beliefs, begins to incorporate these energies into its reality-warping effects. The result is that the sarcophagus does not respond the way it should to the mech's efforts. Systems that should have failed catastrophically under such abuse somehow keep functioning. Seals that should have ruptured hold just long enough. The whole contraption remains intact through sheer, improbable luck, which is exactly what the Orks expect to happen because, of course, good loot does not break that easily. Finally, after what feels like an eternity of being hammered on, cut, pried at, and generally abused, the sarcophagus's outer casing gives way. The mech triumphantly pulls away a large section of armor plating, revealing the inner workings of the system. They peer inside, expecting to find valuable components, interesting gubbins, or possibly a pile of shiny loot. Instead, they find a nightmare. The interior of the sarcophagus is a tangle of tubes, cables, and organic matter that has fused with mechanical components in ways that defy easy explanation. At the center of this horror is what is left of the sorcerer's physical form, a brain suspended in amniotic fluid, connected to what might be parts of a spinal column, some organ meat that serves unclear purposes, all of it linked to the Dreadnought systems by cables that seem to disappear into flesh without clear boundaries. The mech stares at this for a long moment. In their experience, vehicles should not contain this much squishy bits. Even Ork vehicles, which sometimes incorporate living squigs for various purposes, maintain a clear distinction between the biological and the mechanical. This is something else entirely, and even the mech's instinctive understanding of machinery is not sure how to process it. "What does Zog is this?" the mech says aloud, voicing a question that few Orks ever ask about anything. Around them, other Orks have gathered to look at the open sarcophagus, and they too seem unsettled by what they are seeing. This is not normal loot. This is something weird, even by the standards of Orks, who have fought across dozens of worlds and seen countless strange things. And in that moment of confusion, the sorcerer strikes. The demon within, warp entity versus wag field. The moment the sarcophagus is breached, multiple things happen simultaneously. First, the remaining warding runes, already weakened by the mech's crude attempts to open the container, fail completely. Second, the sorcerer inside, who has been gathering psychic power and waiting for an opportunity, releases it in an explosive burst of warp energy. Third, if the Dreadnought had a demon bound to its systems, that entity also seizes the moment to act. The psychic blast that erupts from the open sarcophagus should, by all rights, kill every Ork in the immediate vicinity. The sorcerer is ancient, powerful, and absolutely furious. They channel their rage into a wave of destructive force that would normally reduce mortal minds to catatonic husks, boil blood in veins, and cause heads to literally explode from psychic pressure. This is the full might of a chaos sorcerer who has studied forbidden lore for 10,000 years, unleashed without restraint or mercy. But something unexpected happens. The Wag field interferes. The psychic blast hits the Wag field like a wave hitting a wall. Except the wall is not solid. It is more like a thick gel that absorbs and disperses energy. The Wag field does not block the psychic attack in the way a Geller field or a psychic null might. Instead, it warps and redirects it, diluting its potency across hundreds or thousands of Ork minds, rather than focusing it on a few targets. The Orks in the immediate vicinity of the sarcophagus do feel something. Their heads hurt. Some of them see strange flashing colors or hear voices that are not there. A few of the smaller Orks, Gretchen mostly, collapse unconscious or begin babbling incoherently. But none of them die. None of them go catatonic. The effect is uncomfortable and confusing, but it is survivable. This is not what the sorcerer expected. In their entire existence, going back thousands of years, they have never encountered a psychic defense quite like this. It is not a defense at all in the traditional sense. It is more like their power is being spread too thin to be effective, diluted across too many targets to achieve the concentration needed to kill. It is as if they are trying to stab someone with a knife, but the knife keeps bending away from the target no matter how hard they thrust. The demon, if one is present, faces a different problem. Demons are creatures of the warp, beings of pure psychic energy, given form and purpose by the emotions and beliefs of mortal creatures. They exist in real space only through tremendous effort, either by possessing a physical form or by being bound into one through sorcerous rituals. The bound demon in a Chaos Dreadnought is typically imprisoned within the machine's systems, forced to power weapons or enhance capabilities against its will. When the warding runes fail and the demon finds itself suddenly free, its first instinct is to manifest in real space and wreak havoc. But the WH40K field interferes with this process as well. The demon tries to draw on the warp to give itself physical form, but the WH40K field is already saturating the local area with psychic energy. It is like trying to pour water into a glass that is already full. The demon's essence simply will not fit in the available psychic space. Worse, from the demon's perspective, is that the WH40K field has its own peculiar flavor. Demons are sustained by specific emotions. Khorne by rage and bloodlust, Nurgle by despair and entropy, Tzeentch by hope and ambition, Slaanesh by excess and sensation. The WH40K field, by contrast, is generated by the Ork desire for a good fight and the belief that they will win. It is not an emotion that easily translates to demonic sustenance. The demon tries to manifest anyway, forcing itself into reality through sheer will. It begins to take form, perhaps as a creature of writhing tendrils and too many eyes, if it serves Tzeentch, or as a rot bloated horror, if it serves Nurgle. The Orks, who moments ago were confused and unsettled by the Sorcerer's psychic attack, now see something they understand much better, a weird monster that needs to be crumped. Dozens of Orks immediately open fire. Shooters rattle, rockets fly, and choppers are raised for combat. The demon, still struggling to fully manifest in the hostile psychic environment of the WH40K field, finds itself under physical attack before it has even fully formed. Bullets and rockets tear through its half-formed substance. Orks charge forward with characteristic fearlessness, swinging their weapons at a creature that exists only partially in real space. Under normal circumstances, a demon of any significant power could shrug off such attacks. Physical weapons have limited effectiveness against warp entities unless they are specially blessed or psychically active. But the demon is weakened by the interference of the WH40K field, and the Orks are attacking in such overwhelming numbers that even limited effectiveness adds up. It is death by 1,000 cuts, quite literally. The demon screams, a sound that exists on both psychic and physical levels, and tries to retreat back into the warp. But retreating is not easy. The WH40K field, which prevented it from fully manifesting, now makes it difficult to de-manifest. The demon finds itself trapped in a partially physical state, visible and vulnerable, being torn apart by crude weapons wielded by creatures that should not be able to harm it at all. Meanwhile, the sorcerer inside the sarcophagus is facing their own crisis. Their psychic attack failed. The demon, if there was one, is clearly not going to provide the distraction they had hoped for. The Orks are now aware that something dangerous is happening, but instead of fleeing or approaching with caution, they are getting more excited. From the sorcerer's perspective, listening to the Ork voices and feeling the vibrations of combat, the greenskins seem to think this is all great fun. The sorcerer tries a different approach. Instead of a broad psychic blast, they focus their power on a single target, the big mech who opened the sarcophagus. They reach into the mech's mind with all their skill and force, attempting to overwhelm their consciousness, turn them into a puppet, or simply cause their brain to shut down entirely. The psychic assault hits the mech's mind like a battering ram. For a moment, the mech staggers, their vision swimming with images that make no sense. Vast libraries of forbidden knowledge, cities of brass burning in the warp, the laughing faces of demons. But then, the WH40K field reasserts itself. The mech's mind, already simple and direct by design, proves surprisingly resistant to manipulation. There is just not that much complexity there to corrupt or control. More importantly, the mech is surrounded by hundreds of other Orks, all contributing to the WH40K field. The collective psychic energy of the greenskins provides a kind of buffer, a resistance to the sorcerer's mental invasion. It is like trying to pick a lock while someone keeps jostling your arm. The sorcerer has the skill and the power, but the constant interference of the WH40K field makes precision work nearly impossible. The mech shakes their head, dispelling the visions, and looks down at the open sarcophagus with new understanding. "This thing's got some kind of weird Zoggin psyker in it," they announced to the other orcs. This is both accurate and completely inadequate as a description of what they are dealing with, but it is enough for the orcs to understand that they need to be careful. Careful, in orc terms, means hitting it with something heavy until it stops being weird. The mech grabs their big hammer again and prepares to smash the entire sarcophagus into scrap metal. The sorcerer, sensing the impending destruction of their physical form, makes a desperate decision. They reach out not with destructive power, but with communication. Using what psychic ability they can muster through the interference of the WH40K field, the sorcerer tries to speak to the mech. It is not verbal communication, more a projection of intent and meaning directly into the mech's consciousness. The message is simple. I can make you powerful. I can give you knowledge. I can help you build weapons beyond your wildest imaginings. The mech pauses, hammer raised. They are getting some kind of funny thoughts in their head, ideas about shiny new gubbins and really impressive weapons that would make all the other meeks jealous. They are not entirely sure where these ideas are coming from, but they are intriguing. This is the sorcerer's mistake. They are trying to tempt an orc with promises of power and knowledge, tactics that work well on humans or even on some space marines. But orcs do not think like other races. The mech is not interested in power for its own sake or in forbidden knowledge. The mech just wants to build interesting stuff and see if it works. The ideas the sorcerer is projecting are appealing, but only because they sound like they would be fun to build, not because they represent any kind of corrupting influence. The mech lowers their hammer and thinks for a moment, which is a dangerous thing for an orc to do. Then they make a decision that will prove to be catastrophic for everyone involved. "Right," the mech says. "We's gonna keep this weird psyker box thing. Might be useful, yeah? But first, we's gonna make some improvements." The sorcerer, hearing this through their psychic connection to the mech's mind, feels a sensation they have not experienced in thousands of years, genuine dread. Not the theatrical dread of horror at corruption, or the religious dread of facing the divine, but the simple, visceral dread of knowing that something terrible is about to happen and being completely powerless to stop it. The orcs drag what is left of the Dreadnought sarcophagus with its psychically screaming occupant deeper into the mech's workshop. The demon, if it survived the initial assault, is likely being chopped into pieces and used as raw material for some unrelated project. The warding runes that protected the sorcerer are gone. The psychometric barriers that preserved their sanity are damaged. And now, a bunch of orcs who think they are helping are about to start modifying their prison with power tools and enthusiastic ignorance. For a being who has studied the intricacies of the warp for millennia, who has bargained with demon princes and stood in the presence of chaos gods, this is the ultimate nightmare. To be entirely at the mercy of creatures who have no concept of mercy and who think that hitting things with a hammer is an acceptable solution to every problem. Modification and improvement. Orky enhancements. What follows is a process that, if the sorcerer still possessed a physical body capable of such things, would cause them to weep with despair. The orcs begin their improvements with the kind of enthusiasm and complete lack of understanding that characterizes all orc engineering projects. The first problem the mechs identify is that the sarcophagus is not properly attached to anything. In its original configuration, it would have been integrated into the Dreadnought's chassis, connected by dozens of cables and support systems. Now, it is just a heavily damaged box containing a brain in a jar and a lot of weird tubes. This will not do. The mechs decide that if they are going to use this thing, they need to mount it on something useful. The question becomes, what should they mount it on? The original Dreadnought chassis is in pieces, scattered across the battlefield, or already looted for parts. The mechs have several options available in their workshop. A partially completed Def Dread, a looted Lehman Russ tank with its turret blown off, a converted truck that is missing most of its roof, or a completely scratch-built vehicle that the mechs have been working on that defies easy categorization. After much discussion and a few brief fistfights, the mechs decide to mount the sarcophagus on the Def Dread. This decision is based on sound Orky logic. The Def Dread is also piloted by an Ork in a box, so it makes sense that this weird, Humy psyker in a box would work the same way. The fact that Def Dreads are piloted by Orks who have been driven insane and wired into their machines against their will seems, to the mechs, like a point of commonality rather than a warning sign. The process of mounting the sarcophagus to the Def Dread involves a lot of cutting, welding, and creative use of rivets. The mechs cut away portions of the Def Dread's original pilot compartment, which contained an Ork who was too crazy even by Ork standards and who had been sealed in for his own safety. They unceremoniously dump this unfortunate Ork out of his housing. He staggers away, babbling about enemies only he can see, and begin fitting the Sorcerer's sarcophagus into the space. The sarcophagus does not fit. This is not surprising, as it was designed for a completely different chassis with completely different specifications. But Orks are nothing if not adaptable. When something does not fit, you make it fit. This is accomplished through the generous application of hammers, cutting torches, and the occasional explosion when a Gretchen welds something in the wrong place. The Sorcerer, experiencing all of this from inside their prison, is forced to endure sensations that their mind cannot properly process. They feel cables being ripped out of connection ports. They feel new connections being forcibly jammed into interfaces that were never designed for them. They feel their life support systems being disconnected and reconnected in ways that should not work, but somehow do, because the WAG field insists that if the Orks think it should work, then it does. The psychometric barrier, already damaged, is being further degraded by the modifications. Portions of it are cut away to make the sarcophagus fit in its new housing. Other portions are accidentally reinforced when Orks weld random bits of armor plating to the exterior to make it more tough-like. The result is a psychic resonance chamber that is now wildly unstable, amplifying some psychic frequencies while dampening others in completely unpredictable ways. Next, the mechs address the problem of weapons. The Def Dread originally mounted two massive close combat weapons, a combination of drills, saws, and crushing claws designed to tear apart enemy vehicles and infantry. The mechs decide to keep one of these, because it looks properly Orky and violent. The other arm, however, they replace with a weapon salvaged from the original Chaos Dreadnought, a heavy flamer that is still inscribed with warp-tainted runes and that occasionally leaks demonic ichor. The installation of this weapon is done with no understanding of the rituals or protections that should accompany handling chaos-corrupted equipment. The mechs simply unbolt it from wherever they found it and bolt it to the Def Dread's arm assembly. The warp-tainted runes that cover the weapon begin to interact with the Sorcerer's psychic emanations in ways that were never intended, creating feedback loops of corrupting energy. To make matters worse, the Orks decide that the Def Dread needs more Daka. This is the universal Ork solution to any problem. If it does not have enough guns, add more guns. They mount additional shooters, rockets, and a big shooter to various points on the chassis, without regard for balance, firing arcs, or ammunition supply. Some of these weapons are aimed forward. Some are aimed to the sides. One is pointed almost straight up for reasons known only to the mech who installed it. The power supply is the next problem. The Def Dread's original reactor was designed to power Ork systems, which have very different energy requirements than chaos-corrupted Imperial technology. The Sorcerer's sarcophagus needs a steady supply of precisely regulated power to keep the brain alive and the psychic resonance systems functional. The Def Dread's reactor produces power in violent, irregular surges that would fry normal electronics. The solution, in Ork logic, is to add more power. They bolt a second reactor to the Def Dread's back, this one looted from a destroyed Space Marine Rhino. They connect it to the first reactor with cables that spark ominously. They hook both reactors up to the sarcophagus through a junction box that one of the mechs claims probably regulates the zappy bits, yeah? The junction box is, in fact, just a metal box full of wires connected to other wires with no particular logic or protection systems. But here is where the WH40K field performs its reality warping magic. The mechs believe that this cobbled-together power system will work. They are confident that the cables they have installed will carry the power without exploding. They think the junction box will regulate the energy flow properly. And because they believe these things, the WH40K field makes them true, at least to the extent necessary for the whole contraption to function without immediately killing everyone nearby. The Sorcerer, feeling their life support systems connected to this improvised and impossible power grid, experiences a sensation that they can only describe as reality revulsion. They are a being who has spent millennia studying the fundamental laws of the universe, both material and immaterial. They understand how energy flows, how systems interact, how the warp and real space touch each other. What the Orks have created violates every principle they know. It should not work, it cannot work, and yet it does work because Ork belief makes it work. The modifications continue. The mechs add armor plating, not systematically, but wherever they think it. Looks good. They paint portions of the Death Dread in their clan colors, covering over some of the Chaos runes in the process. They add decorative elements, skulls, both Ork and enemy, dangling chains, trophies from previous battles, and graffiti in Orkish script that translates roughly to various boasts about how tough and killy this machine is going to be. At one point, a mech decides that the sarcophagus needs a viewing port so they can see if the Humi Psyker is still alive in there. They cut a hole in the armor and install a thick piece of cracked glass they salvaged from somewhere. This gives the Sorcerer, for the first time since their capture, a direct view of the outside world. What they see is an Ork mech's face pressed against the glass, peering in at them with an expression of cheerful curiosity. "Oi!" the mech shouts, loud enough that the Sorcerer can hear it through the glass. "Can you hear me in there? We's gonna make you fight real good, yeah? Gonna be proper tough." The Sorcerer tries to respond, tries to project psychic terror, or at least communicate their rage. But the modifications have left their psychic abilities even more unreliable. What comes out is a burst of formless psychic static that makes the mech's ears ring and gives them a brief nosebleed. The mech wipes their nose and grins, showing huge tusks. "Yeah, you got some zogging power in you. This is gonna be good." The final modifications are perhaps the most egregious. The mechs install a control system that will, theoretically, allow the Sorcerer to pilot the Death Dread. This system consists of cables running from the sarcophagus to the Death Dread's movement systems, weapons, and sensors. The mechs do not understand that the Sorcerer used psychometric interfaces and thought-activated controls in their original Dreadnought. Instead, they wire everything up like they would for an Ork pilot, crude mechanical linkages that respond to physical movement. But the Sorcerer has no hands. They have no body below the neck. They are a brain in a jar, connected to their original interface systems, which are now connected to Ork systems in ways that make no sense. The mechs do not understand this problem. They assume that if they hook everything up, it will just work, because that is how things work in Ork engineering. And terrifyingly, they are right. The WH40K field, combined with the degraded psychometric barriers, and the Sorcerer's own desperate attempts to maintain some control over their situation, creates a psychic feedback loop that allows the Sorcerer to interface with the Ork systems. It is not clean, it is not precise, but it works, in the same way that all Ork technology works, through sheer, stubborn insistence that it should. The entire process takes about 3 days, which is remarkably fast by Ork standards for such a complex project. When it is done, the result is an abomination that defies easy description. It is part Death Dread, part Chaos Dreadnought, part random scrap metal, and part psychic impossibility. It should not exist, it should not function, and it certainly should not be piloted by a 10,000-year-old Chaos Sorcerer who is trapped inside a partially destroyed sarcophagus that has been bolted into a housing designed for an insane Ork. The big mech stands back and admires their work, hands on their hips. Right, they say with satisfaction. Time to see if it works. Grot, go press the big red button and start her up. A nearby Gretchen, looking terrified, approaches what might be the control panel and presses what might be the activation switch. And then things get really interesting. Attempts at operation when Orks try to use it. The moment the Gretchen presses the activation switch, several things happen in rapid succession. First, power flows from the dual reactor system into the sarcophagus through the improvised junction box. The energy surge is massive, irregular, and completely wrong for the delicate life. Support systems. Second, the control interfaces activate, sending signals to the Def Dread systems in patterns that make no logical sense. Third, the Sorcerer inside, feeling their prison coming to life around them, tries to seize control of the situation. The result is catastrophic in a uniquely Orky way. The Def Dread lurches to its feet, servos screaming in protest. It takes 2 steps forward, then 1 step back, then spins in a circle for no apparent reason. The weapon systems activate randomly, the heavy flamer spewing promethium fire across the workshop and forcing Orks to dive for cover. The shooter on top begins firing, bullets ricocheting off the ceiling and sending Gretchen scrambling for safety. The rocket launcher does not fire, but it does make a concerning grinding noise that suggests it is trying very hard to do so. The Sorcerer, experiencing the Def Dread through the bizarre interface the Orks have created, feels like they are trying to control their body while extremely drunk and also experiencing severe nerve damage. The responses are delayed, imprecise, and sometimes completely contrary to their intentions. They try to take a step forward, and the machine lurches sideways. They try to aim the flamer, and it sprays fire in a completely different direction. They try to access the weapons systems in a controlled manner, and every gun on the machine fires at once. The mechs watching this display are delighted. "Look at that!" one of them shouts over the noise of weapons fire and servo motors. "It's working. Well, sorta. Needs a bit more tuning." The Sorcerer screams psychically, a wordless expression of rage and frustration that ripples through the wag field. Every Ork in the workshop feels it as a momentary headache or a flash of anger. A few of the smaller Orks start fighting with each other, responding to the sudden surge of aggressive psychic energy. The mechs just think this is all very exciting and entertaining. The Def Dread continues to rampage around the workshop, smashing into walls, knocking over workbenches, and generally wreaking havoc. The Sorcerer is trying to stop it, trying to gain control, but the interface is too alien, too unpredictable. It is like trying to pilot a vehicle when all the controls have been randomized and also you are blindfolded and someone is occasionally hitting you with a stick. Eventually, after what feels like an eternity, but is probably only a few minutes, the power systems overload and the Def Dread shuts down. It freezes in mid-step, 1 foot raised, weapons still pointed in random directions, smoke pouring from various joints and connections. In the sudden silence that follows, the mechs approach cautiously. "Well," says the big mech, "that was interesting. Clearly needs some work. And maybe we should put it outside before we turn it on again, yeah?" The Sorcerer, exhausted from the attempt to control the machine and still reeling from the disorientation of the interface, would laugh if they had the capability. These primitives think that was interesting. They think the problem is just that the machine needs some adjustments. They have no concept of the fundamental incompatibility between what they have created and the laws of reality itself. Over the next several days, the mechs make various improvements to their creation. They adjust the power settings, though this mostly consists of randomly turning dials and seeing what happens. They recalibrate the control systems, which means hitting things with hammers until the responses seem less unpredictable. They add more armor to areas that got damaged during the test run, and they paint more sections of the machine in what they believe are lucky colors. The Sorcerer, forced to endure all of this, begins to adapt to their new situation in ways that they would never have predicted. The psychometric barriers that once protected their sanity are almost completely gone now, destroyed by Ork modifications. This should have driven them insane, but the constant exposure to the WH field is having an unexpected effect. It is actually stabilizing them in a bizarre way. The WH field does not discriminate. It takes all psychic energy in its area of influence and incorporates it into its reality warping effect. The sorcerer's psychic emanations, their rage and frustration and malevolent intent, are being absorbed by the field and redirected. Instead of the sorcerer corrupting the Orks, the WH field is, in a sense, orkifying the sorcerer's consciousness. This does not mean the sorcerer is becoming an Ork. They still have all their memories, all their knowledge, all their hatred of the Imperium, and devotion to the Chaos Gods. But their thought patterns are beginning to change in subtle ways. They are starting to think in more direct terms, in simpler cause and effect chains. Complex, multi-layered plans are giving way to more immediate, action-focused thinking. Most disturbingly, they are starting to understand Ork logic. When the mechs explain that painting part of the machine red will make it go faster, the sorcerer's initial response would normally be to dismiss this as superstition. But now, experiencing the effect firsthand, feeling how the WH field actually does make red things go faster, they begin to accept it as a fundamental truth of their new existence. This is deeply unsettling for a being who has spent millennia studying the immutable laws of sorcery and warp manipulation. The next test comes after the mechs have made what they consider sufficient improvements. They activate the Death Dread again, this time outside the workshop, and with all nearby Orks instructed to stay clear in case things get a bit explodey. This time, the sorcerer is ready. They have been practicing in their mind, trying to understand the Ork control systems through trial and error and psychic intuition. They have been studying the patterns of the WH field, learning how it flows and changes, and most importantly, they have accepted that they cannot fight this situation with their normal tools of subtlety and precise manipulation. They need to think like an Ork. When the power flows in, the sorcerer does not try to carefully control every system. Instead, they just push forward with their will, demanding that the machine move, and it does. The Death Dread takes a step forward, then another. The movements are still jerky and unpredictable, but they are movements in a direction that the sorcerer intended. The watching Orks cheer. "Look at dat, it's walking. The weird Humy Psyker box is working." Encouraged by this success, the sorcerer tries to turn the machine. They think about turning, visualize it happening, and demand that it occur. The Death Dread rotates, grinding gears, protesting, but accomplishing the turn. More cheers from the Orks. The sorcerer, feeling a surge of something that might be triumph, or might just be relief at not being completely helpless, tries to activate the weapons. They focus on the heavy flamer, the weapon they remember from their own Dreadnought, and will it to fire. The flamer responds, sending a gout of promethium across the testing ground. The Orks whoop with excitement. But then the sorcerer makes a mistake. Emboldened by these successes, they try to do something more complex. They attempt to use their psychic powers directly, channeling warp energy through the degraded psychometric barriers and the Ork systems. They try to cast a bolt of warp lightning, a simple spell that they have performed thousands of times. The spell manifests, but not in the way they intended. The warp lightning emerges from every part of the Death Dread simultaneously, arcing between armor plates, cooking off ammunition, and setting several nearby Gretchen on fire. The machine itself becomes a conductor for uncontrolled psychic energy, every metal surface crackling with eldritch power. The sorcerer's scream of frustration manifests as a psychic shockwave that knocks down every Ork within 20 feet. And then, because this is a machine built by Orks and powered by belief as much as by reactors, the overload triggers a chain reaction. The jury-rigged power systems cannot handle the surge of warp energy. The junction box, already a disaster waiting to happen, begins to glow red-hot. The dual reactors both start overloading at the same time. Every weapon on the machine fires at once, in all directions, creating a storm of bullets, rockets, and flame that turns the testing ground into a war zone. The mechs watch in awe. "By Gork and Mork," breathes the big mech. "That's the most orky thing I've ever seen a humie make." The Death Dread, with the Sorcerer trapped inside and unable to stop what they have set in motion, continues to rampage. It is firing wildly, moving erratically, and broadcasting psychic chaos in all directions. This is not the controlled destruction of a chaos Dreadnought in the hands of an experienced pilot. This is pure, uncontrolled mayhem, and the Orks love it. The catastrophic outcomes. What goes wrong? The immediate outcome of the Death Dread's uncontrolled rampage is, by Ork standards, pretty entertaining. The machine eventually runs out of ammunition, runs out of fuel for the flamer, and exhausts the Sorcerer's psychic reserves. It stumbles to a halt, smoking and sparking, in the middle of a crater it accidentally created with its own weapons fire. Several nearby structures are on fire. A dozen Gretchen are unconscious, and there is a small warp rift that opened briefly before snapping closed again, leaving an area of disturbed reality that will probably cause problems later. The mechs examine the damage and make what they consider to be important observations. First, the machine works, sort of. Second, it is very killy, which is good. Third, it seems to make weird psychic stuff happen, which is interesting. Fourth, it definitely needs better control systems if they want to point it at enemies rather than having it just destroy everything around it indiscriminately. The Sorcerer, trapped inside and completely drained, can only think one thought. This is a nightmare from which they will never wake. But this immediate chaos is just the beginning. The real problems start to manifest over time as the hybrid Ork Chaos Dreadnought abomination interacts with the world around it in ways that should not be possible. The first major issue is the warp corruption. The original Chaos Dreadnought was saturated with warp taint, its every component touched by thousands of years of exposure to the Imperium. This corruption does not simply disappear because Orks have bolted on some new parts. Instead, it begins to spread through the Ork components, changing them in subtle and not so subtle ways. The Ork armor plating that was welded to the sarcophagus begins to develop strange markings that the Orks did not paint there. The metal itself seems to shift and flow when no one is looking directly at it. The machinery makes sounds that are not quite mechanical, whispers and screams that seem to come from somewhere other than the physical components. Gretchen, who work on maintaining the machine, start having nightmares about things with too many eyes and geometries that hurt to look at. The WH40K field is fighting against this corruption, constantly pushing back against the taint of chaos. This creates a kind of psychic battleground around the Death Dread, a zone where reality is even more unstable than usual. Probability gets weird in this zone. Things that should work do not. Things that should not work do. Weapons fire might curve in flight, following paths that seem to bend around the Death Dread. Enemies might find their shots missing when they should hit, or hitting when they should miss. The Sorcerer, experiencing all of this from inside their sarcophagus, begins to understand something profound and terrible. The WH40K field and the warp corruption are not cancelling each other out. They are creating a new kind of phenomenon, something that has characteristics of both, but is entirely neither. It is a psychic hybrid, an abomination that should not exist according to either Ork or Chaos metaphysics. This hybrid effect starts doing things that neither the Orks nor the Sorcerer intended. The Death Dread develops a kind of semi-autonomous behavior, acting on impulses that seem to come from neither the Sorcerer's will nor Ork control systems. It will occasionally move on its own when powered down, taking single steps or turning to face perceived threats that no one else can see. It fires weapons when no one is at the controls, targeting enemies with uncanny accuracy that is completely at odds with normal orc marksmanship. The orcs think this is great. They interpret it as the machine spirit being really enthusiastic about fighting. They do not understand that what they are seeing is the confused amalgamation of a chaos sorcerer's will, demonic taint, and the Warhammer field, trying to reconcile three fundamentally incompatible realities. The second major problem manifests when the orcs actually try to use their creation in a real battle. The war boss, hearing about this amazing new fighting machine, demands to see it in action. A raid is organized against a nearby Imperial outpost, and the Death Dread is deployed alongside regular orc forces. The battle starts normally enough. Orcs charge across open ground, firing wildly and whooping with joy at the prospect of violence. The Death Dread advances with them, the Sorcerer inside grimly accepting that they have no choice but to participate in this farce. Imperial Guardsmen open fire, lass bolts stitching across orc armor and dropping some of the greenskins, but failing to stop the momentum of the charge. And then things go very wrong in several different directions simultaneously. The Sorcerer, seeing humans for the first time since their capture, reflexively tries to use their psychic powers to crush the minds of the enemy. But their powers, filtered through the orc systems and warped by the WH40K field, manifest in completely unexpected ways. Instead of the precise telepathic attacks they intended, they create a wave of raw psychic pressure that causes guardsmen to see hallucinations of giant green monsters, even bigger and scarier than the actual orcs charging at them. This is helpful to the orcs, but it is not what the Sorcerer meant to do at all. At the same time, the warp corruption that has been spreading through the orc components chooses this moment to manifest more dramatically. Parts of the Death Dread's armor begin to writhe and change, taking on characteristics of demonic flesh. Runes that the orcs painted over earlier burn through the new paint, glowing with unholy light. The heavy flamer starts spewing not just promethium, but warp fire, flames that burn in colors that should not exist, and that cause anything they touch to age rapidly or mutate in disturbing ways. The WH40K field, concentrated by the presence of so many orcs in close proximity, pushes back against this corruption harder than ever. The result is that the Death Dread becomes the epicenter of a localized reality storm. The ground around it cracks and reforms, gravity fluctuates, and time itself seems to stutter. An Imperial Guardsman fires his laser gun. The beam hits the Death Dread, and then the beam appears to reverse, flowing backward through the air to return to the gun before the trigger is even pulled. The orcs, witnessing all of this, think it is the most amazing thing they have ever seen. "Did you see that?" one of them shouts to his mates. "The weird Psycho Dread made the Humi shoot itself. That's proper clever, that is." The Sorcerer, trapped at the center of this chaos, is trying desperately to maintain some control over the situation. They attempt to target enemy positions with actual tactical thinking, but the orc systems respond to intention rather than precision. They think about shooting at an enemy fortification, and every weapon on the machine fires in roughly that direction, turning the area into a storm of explosions and shrapnel that kills as many orcs as it does Imperial Guardsmen. The war boss, observing from a position of relative safety, is not pleased. "Oi!" they bellow over the vox. "You gets in the weird dread. Stop shooting the boys and shoot the humies." The Sorcerer, understanding Orcish now thanks to prolonged exposure to the WH field, feels a surge of indignant rage. They are a master of sorcerous warfare. They have commanded armies of Chaos Space Marines. They will not be given orders by some jumped-up greenskin barbarian, but they also realize that if they do not get control of this situation, the orcs might decide their creation is more trouble than it is worth and just scrap it for parts. So, swallowing what remains of their ancient pride, they try to focus their fire on actual enemies rather than everything in sight. This works, marginally. The Death Dread begins to advance in a direction that could charitably be called toward the enemy. Its weapons fire becomes slightly more directed, though still wildly inaccurate by any normal standard. The psychic effects continue to create chaos, but at least most of that chaos is happening to the Imperial defenders rather than the Orks. The battle reaches its climax when the Death Dread encounters an Imperial Sentinel Walker, a light scout vehicle armed with a multi-laser. Under normal circumstances, a Sentinel would be no match for a Dreadnought of any kind. But these are not normal circumstances. The Sorcerer sees the Sentinel and identifies it as a threat. They channel psychic energy to enhance their weapons, they aim the heavy flamer, and they advance to engage. But at the same moment, the warp corruption surges, the WH field pushes back, and the Ork control systems interpret the Sorcerer's commands in their own unique way. What follows is less a fight and more a cascade of improbable events. The Sentinel fires its multi-laser, but the beams curve around the Death Dread as if repelled by some invisible force. The Death Dread's heavy flamer shoots a gout of warp fire that should incinerate the Sentinel, but the flames instead spiral upward in a corkscrew pattern before dissipating into non-existence. The Sorcerer tries to use telekinesis to simply crush the Lightwalker, but the psychic energy manifests as green lightning, very orky lightning, that makes the Sentinel's metal frame magnetic, causing it to attract every bit of loose metal debris in the area until it is buried under a pile of scrap. The Sentinel's pilot, trapped under tons of metal and completely unable to explain what just happened, ejects from their vehicle in a panic. The Death Dread, mission accomplished in the most confusing way possible, turns its attention to the next target. The Imperial forces, facing this abomination that seems to warp reality itself with its mere presence, do the sensible thing. They call for an immediate tactical withdrawal. The Orks, delighted by their victory, chase the fleeing guardsmen and loot everything that is not nailed down, and several things that are. After the battle, the war boss approaches the Death Dread. Not bad, they concede. Still a bit wobbly, and you shot the boys a few times, but you crumped the Humies good. We's gonna keep you, I think. The Sorcerer, exhausted and reeling from the experience, can only think that they have somehow managed to survive another day in this bizarre existence. They are becoming effective at fighting alongside Orks, which is perhaps the most humiliating realization they have ever had in 10,000 years of existence. But the problems are only going to get worse, because every battle damages the already fragile systems holding the Sorcerer and the machine together. Every engagement spreads more warp corruption through the Ork components, and every day spent in proximity to the WH field erodes more of the Sorcerer's identity and sanity. The catastrophic outcome is not a single dramatic explosion. It is a slow-motion disaster that threatens to consume everyone involved. Broader implications and known examples. While the specific scenario of Orks capturing a Sorcerer Dreadnought is rare, the broader pattern of greenskins looting Chaos equipment and creating dangerous hybrid abominations has precedent in Warhammer 40k lore. Understanding these parallels helps us grasp just how catastrophic the consequences of such looting can become. The fundamental problem is that Chaos corruption and Ork technology operate on completely opposite principles. Chaos corruption is about the deliberate, carefully controlled channeling of warp energies for specific purposes. It requires rituals, discipline, and an understanding of the symbolic and metaphysical significance of every component. Ork technology, by contrast, works through collective belief and aggressive simplicity. The two approaches are so incompatible that bringing them together should result in immediate catastrophic failure. Should, but does not, because the WH field has its own rules, and those rules sometimes override even the fundamental laws of Chaos corruption. There are recorded instances of Orks looting Chaos vehicles and weapons, with results that range from darkly comedic to genuinely terrifying. During the Gothic War, an Ork freebooter captain named Captain Bloodskull captured a Chaos cruiser that had been possessed by a demon. The ship, known as the Bane of Cadia, was a terror weapon. its hull inscribed with runes that drove Imperial crews mad just from looking at it. The Orks, being Orks, simply painted over most of the runes with their own graffiti, welded on additional armor plating and weapons, and renamed it Da Bloodflag. The demon bound to the Tumtient ship systems found itself in a very confusing situation. It was accustomed to feeding on the fear and despair of its victims. But Orks do not feel fear or despair. They feel excitement and the desire for a good fight. The demon's attempts to corrupt the Ork crew were about as effective as trying to poison someone who eats garbage for fun. The ship continued to function, after a fashion. The demon would sometimes manifest in the corridors, trying to terrify the Orks with visions of their darkest fears. The Orks would respond by shooting it, hitting it with wrenches, or just ignoring it depending on whether they had time to deal with weird stuff at that particular moment. Eventually, the demon seemed to give up on corruption and just settled for occasionally making the lights flicker and causing doors to stick, which the Orks interpreted as the ship having a bit of character. This example illustrates an important principle. Chaos entities are sustained by specific emotions and belief patterns. When they encounter Orks, who have completely different emotional responses and belief systems, the normal rules of corruption simply do not apply. The demon in the ship wanted terror. It got curiosity and mild annoyance. It wanted souls to devour. It got greenskins whose souls are so tied up in the wag field that separating one for consumption is nearly impossible. A Sorcerer Dreadnought represents an even more complex version of this problem. You have not just a demon, but also a conscious, intelligent sorcerer who has spent millennia studying how to manipulate the warp. They should be more than capable of corrupting or controlling a bunch of primitive Orks. In theory. In practice, the sorcerer encounters the same fundamental problem as the demon in the ship. Orks do not respond to corruption the way other races do. You cannot tempt an Ork with promises of power, because Orks believe they already are powerful. You cannot offer them forbidden knowledge, because Orks trust their instincts over any amount of learning. You cannot seduce them with luxury, because Orks consider a good fight more valuable than any material comfort. Worse, from the sorcerer's perspective, is that their very presence in the Ork warband begins to have unintended effects. The warp corruption they carry with them starts to interact with looted Imperial equipment in dangerous ways. Weapon systems that were never designed to channel chaos energies suddenly find themselves doing exactly that, with predictably explosive results. Vehicles that should be protected from demonic possession by their machine spirits instead become vulnerable because Ork modifications have damaged those protections. There are unverified reports from inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos about Ork warbands that have become touched by chaos through prolonged exposure to captured chaos equipment. These reports are controversial and heavily disputed, as the general consensus is that Orks are nearly immune to chaos corruption due to the wag field. But some inquisitors have noted disturbing patterns. Ork tribes that fight with uncharacteristic cruelty, that seem to take pleasure in suffering rather than just enjoying a good scrap, that display symbols and behaviors that echo chaos worship, even if the Orks themselves do not understand what they are doing. The most famous and disturbing of these cases is the supposed blood cults of certain Ork tribes, particularly among exiled freebooter bands. These Orks, separated from larger WA-AG fields and exposed to Khorne-corrupted equipment over long periods, allegedly began developing what might be very primitive Khorne worship. They would make offerings of skulls, paint their equipment in blood, and engage in brutal ritual combat that goes beyond the normal Ork love of fighting. Mainstream Imperial scholars dismiss these reports as exaggeration or misunderstanding of normal Ork behavior. After all, Orks already love fighting, already collect skulls as trophies, and already paint everything in sight. How would you distinguish between a Khorne-corrupted Ork and a regular Ork having a particularly good day? But the inquisitors who have studied these cases argue that there is a difference, subtle but real. Normal Orks fight for the joy of combat. They live for the moment of the fight itself. Potentially corrupted orcs fight with purpose, with a desire not just to win, but to make their enemies suffer, to extract the maximum amount of violence from every encounter. It is a distinction that might seem academic until you face it on the battlefield. If these reports are true, and if a Sorcerer Dreadnought were to remain with an Orc warband for an extended period, the potential for spreading this kind of subtle corruption is significant. The Sorcerer would not be actively trying to corrupt the Orcs. They would be trying to survive and maybe to escape. But their very presence, combined with the damaged, warding runes and the unstable psychometric barriers, would be constantly leaking warp energy into the environment. In most circumstances, the WH field would dilute and disperse this corruption, making it harmless. But if the field were weaker than normal, if the Orc warband were small and isolated, if they suffered a series of defeats that dampened their collective enthusiasm, then the corruption might gain a foothold. It would not look like normal chaos corruption. It would be filtered through Orc psychology and the WH field, creating something new and potentially more dangerous, because it would be unpredictable. There is also the question of what happens to the Sorcerer's own psyche over time. Prolonged exposure to the WH field, combined with the degradation of their psychometric barriers, is changing them. They are thinking more directly, more simply, more like an Orc. If this process continues, it is possible that the ancient Sorcerer could essentially become Orcified in their thought patterns while retaining all their psychic power and knowledge. Imagine a being with the psychic might of a Chaos Sorcerer, the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years, and the straightforward, aggressive mindset of an Orc. Such a creature would be uniquely dangerous. They would not waste time on elaborate plots or subtle manipulation. They would simply identify a target and hit it with overwhelming psychic force, without hesitation or restraint. They would be corruption personified, but corruption that fights like a brawler rather than a schemer. The Imperium, if it ever discovered such an abomination existed, would classify it as a hereticus grandis threat, something requiring the immediate deployment of the Inquisition, Space Marines, and possibly even Grey Knights to contain. The problem is that no one in the Imperium would believe that such a thing could exist. The official doctrine is that Orcs are too simple and too protected by the WH field to be corrupted by chaos. Finding out that they could create hybrid Chaos Orc horrors by looting the wrong equipment would require a fundamental reassessment of Xenos threat models. Meanwhile, from the Chaos perspective, the loss of a Sorcerer Dreadnought to Orc capture would be considered a catastrophic intelligence failure. Such a valuable asset should have been better protected. If recovery is possible, every effort would be made to retrieve the Sorcerer and their knowledge. But if the Chaos forces arrive to find their ancient warrior trapped inside an Orc Def Dread, fighting alongside greenskins and showing signs of WH field contamination, they might face an impossible choice: rescue a corrupted asset or destroy it to prevent further degradation. The Chaos Gods themselves would find this situation fascinating for different reasons. Horn would see the violence and bloodshed and approve, even if it comes wrapped in green skin and bad grammar. Tzeentch would be intrigued by the unexpected change and the new form of corruption emerging. Nurgle might see the degradation of the Sorcerer's identity as a kind of entropy and decay worth encouraging. Slaanesh would just enjoy the sheer excess and chaos of the whole situation. The Sorcerer, trapped in the middle of all of this, would experience a kind of existential crisis that no amount of chaos worship could have prepared them for. They served the Dark Gods faithfully for millennia. They studied the deepest mysteries of the warp. They survived the Horus Heresy, the Long War, and countless battles across the galaxy. And now they find themselves as a curiosity in an Orc warband, their grand purpose reduced to the weird psycho box what makes stuff go explodey sometimes. It is, in many ways, a fate worse than death, and it is entirely possible in the grim darkness of the far future, where even the most unlikely scenarios can and do occur with horrifying regularity. Conclusion. The question of what happens when Orks capture a Sorcerer Dreadnought cannot be answered with a single, simple outcome. Instead, we find ourselves exploring a cascade of improbable events, each one stranger and more dangerous than the last. From the initial capture through crude battlefield tactics, to the catastrophic modifications by enthusiastic mech boys, to the ongoing struggle between warp corruption and the WH40K field, every step of this process reveals new layers of complexity and danger. What we see is a fundamental collision between two of the galaxy's most potent forces: the reality-warping power of chaos and the collective belief system of the Orks. Neither can fully overcome the other. The WH field prevents the Sorcerer from unleashing their full psychic might or spreading corruption in the normal ways. The warp taint prevents the Ork modifications from functioning purely on Orky logic, introducing elements of unpredictability even beyond the normal unreliability of Ork technology. The result is something that should not exist: a hybrid abomination that combines the worst aspects of both chaos and Ork engineering. It is dangerous not just because it is powerful, but because it is unpredictable in ways that even the most experienced warriors cannot anticipate. Imperial forces trained to fight Chaos Dreadnoughts, or Ork Death Dreads, would find themselves facing something that responds to neither set of tactics effectively. For the Sorcerer trapped inside, the experience represents a slow erosion of everything they once were. Their identity is being stripped away, not through the deliberate corruption of chaos, but through the involuntary transformation induced by the WH field. They are becoming something new, something that has never existed before in the long history of the galaxy. Whether this transformation is a kind of death or a kind of rebirth is a philosophical question that the Sorcerer probably does not have time to contemplate while being shot at by Imperial guardsmen and accidentally shooting their Ork allies. The broader implications for the Warhammer 40k universe are equally disturbing. If Orks can capture and repurpose chaos equipment with some degree of success, and if this creates new forms of corruption that can spread back to Ork populations, then the assumption that greenskins are immune to chaos may need to be reconsidered. The Imperium's defensive strategies rely on certain fundamental truths about how different threats operate. Learning that Orks can become vectors for chaos corruption, even accidentally and imperfectly, would require a complete reassessment of threat priorities. What we learn from examining this scenario is that in Warhammer 40k, the most dangerous threats often come from unexpected combinations. It is not enough to understand how Orks fight or how chaos corrupts. You must also understand what happens when these forces collide, when the unstoppable force of the WH meets the immutable corruption of the warp. When the crudest technology in the galaxy is applied to the most sophisticated demonic machinery. The answer, ultimately, is chaos. Not chaos with a capital C, the realm of the dark gods, but chaos in its most fundamental sense: unpredictability, disorder, and outcomes that no amount of planning or wisdom can anticipate. In a galaxy already drowning in war and madness, the idea that Orks could make things even worse, simply by being themselves, is both darkly comedic and genuinely terrifying. And somewhere in that bizarre hybrid machine, a 10,000-year-old sorcerer is learning to think like an Ork, which might be the most disturbing outcome of all. If you found this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40k's most bizarre scenarios entertaining and informative, please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of the grimdark future. The Emperor protects, but knowledge protects even better, and understanding the strange intersections of the galaxy's many threats might just keep you alive one more day in the grim darkness of the far future. Thank you for listening, and may your loot always be Orky.